Hi, it's me, the storyteller. Thank you for joining me. Most of my stories on this channel are based on actual events, and some aren't. I'll let you decide if these stories are fiction, or if they're not. My name's Luke, and I grew up hunting, fishing, and just being out in nature. My dad taught me a lot about the outdoors, but I had a scary camping experience I don't think I'll ever forget. It was the fall of 2017, just a few days before Halloween. I was 25, a couple years out of college, and trying to make something of myself. I had a communications degree with an emphasis in media studies, so I'd been toying with the idea of starting a YouTube channel focused on camping, gear reviews, solo hikes, stuff like that. I had the camera. I had all the backpacking set up. I figured, why not film my first real solo trip as a sort of pilot episode? I wanted it to feel raw, real, not your average campground with picnic tables and families 2 tents over kind of trip. I needed seclusion, somewhere off the beaten path, if you will. I lived in Rochester, Minnesota at the time, so I picked the driftless area. For those who don't know, the driftless forest area is a stretch of rugged land across parts of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa that was never flattened by glaciers like most of the Midwest. That means deep river-carved valleys, bluffs, ridgelines, and endless forested pockets where you can go miles without seeing another soul. It's beautiful and unsettling at the same time. Like nature decided not to play by the rules there. I chose a spot that wasn't on any official trail, something I'd found mentioned in an old backpacking forum. A user had posted about a clearing near a ridgeline deep in the forest where the stars were perfect and you could hear any and all wildlife in the distance. It sounded poetic, but I was dumb enough to go alone. Once I arrived, I locked up the truck and hit the trail with my pack over one shoulder. Almost immediately, the forest swallowed the sound behind me. No more distant road hum, no more metallic clink of the tailgate. Just the rhythm of boots on soft dirt and the whisper of trees swaying above. The trailhead was barely marked, just a sun-bleached post with no readable sign, half tilted from rot at the base. Somebody had carved initials into the wood, probably decades ago, and the old directional arrow had peeled clean off. Still, the path was there if you knew where to look. Faint, narrow, the kind of trail that didn't see many feet anymore. It was colder than I expected. Not the dry, crisp kind of cold. This clung to your sleeves, sank down your collar. After the first incline, I could feel my breath catching up to me, little clouds forming with every exhale. The trees were thick, mostly pine, but some scattered aspen as I climbed higher. Their white trunks looked like bone, twisted and leaning, bare in places where bark had peeled off like old scabs. Deadfall lined the slope on either side. Some of it looked fresh. About a mile in, I stopped at a fork in the path, if you could even call it that. The left side faded quickly into underbrush, but the right led to an old weathered trail marker, or what was left of one. It had a rusted metal plate nailed to the top, but whatever had been written on it was long gone, worn down to blotches and oxidation. Deep gouges ran diagonally across the wood. I told myself it was weather, but even as I stood there staring, something about it felt deliberate, like claw marks or symbols. I pressed on. At one point, I heard something big shift in the trees off to my right. Then stillness. I stopped, my ears strained to catch the direction. But whatever it was, it didn't move again. I kept walking. About a quarter-mile later, I stopped and pulled out my camera. I figured I'd film a quick journal entry while I caught my breath. I wanted to talk about why I was doing this, why solo camping meant something to me. I told the camera it wasn't for clout. I wasn't trying to be the next flashy wilderness influencer or anything. I just wanted space, time away from people, from pressure, from all the noise that piles up during the week. I talked about my dad a little, how he used to bring me out to places like this when I was younger. Not this remote, but similar. We'd fish or just walk trails. And something about those memories stuck deeper than I realized. I said I wanted to capture that again. Some piece of that calm. Maybe share it. I paused then, staring off into the trees, letting the camera run for a few extra seconds before shutting it off. A breeze stirred the branches above me. It sounded like breathing. That was the moment I started to feel watched. I shook it off and kept going. The sun had shifted now, dropping just enough to tint everything with that early golden edge. And that was when I reached the creek. It wasn't high by any standards, despite the amount of rain we had that year. Once across, it took me the better part of the afternoon to reach my destination, maybe 5 or 6 miles in, and the last stretch was off trail, just following game trails and checking my GPS against a satellite image I had saved. The trees were starting to thin out when I finally found the clearing, and it was incredible. Dead silent. Cool, crisp air. Fallen leaves. No drone sounds of far-off highways. Just me and nature. I spent the rest of the daylight setting up camp, filming everything as I went. Tent placement, camp stove review, gear talk, that kind of thing. I even did a little intro talking into the camera about how this was going to be my new thing. Campscape, I had called the channel. By sunset, I had a fire going, some canned stew bubbling, and my camera mounted on a tripod, catching the glow of the flames. My breath came out in soft clouds as the temperature dropped fast, like it always does in those valleys. Still, it felt peaceful, like I'd done something right. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my sleeping bag and started reviewing footage, trashing unusable clips. That's when I first heard it. Crunch. A single footstep. Clear as day. Not a deer. This was deliberate. Weight. Pressure. Human. I froze, staring at the nylon wall of my tent. I hadn't even zipped the fly shut yet. I slowly turned the camera on, whispered into it that I heard a noise that sounded like a footstep. I crawled forward, peeking out the tent flap with my flashlight. Nothing. Just the soft glow of the dying fire and the trees swaying gently in the windless dark. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was an acorn dropping, I told myself. I zipped the flap closed and laid there, trying to relax. Then I heard it again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. 3 steps this time. Heavier. I turned the camera on again and whispered, trying to document it like it was still just part of the show. But my voice was shaking. A minute passed, then 5. Silence again. Just as I was about to exhale and say, "Screw it, I'm being paranoid," I heard something else. A second set of footsteps, this one coming from a different direction. Then a third. All slow, purposeful, crunch, shuffle, crunch. I shut the camera off. My fear was rising, and I didn't want to document anymore. I wanted to know who or what was out there. After a couple of moments of silence, I tried to tell myself it was maybe other hikers, just passing through. But that didn't make sense. No headlamps, no dogs, no voices, just the sound of slow, measured steps circling my campsite. I turned the camera back on, mostly for the comfort of the tiny red record light. Whispered into it that something wasn't right. Then I reached for my cell phone. No bars, not even one. I mustered up the courage and stepped out of the tent, barefoot, camera in one hand, phone in the other. I slowly panned the light across the tree line. Nothing but silhouettes and a blanket of leaves underfoot. I called out something like, "Is someone there?" No answer. But then, just at the edge of my beam, I caught movement. A shadow ducked behind a tree, and not in an animal way. It was too quick, too vertical. I whispered something into the camera again. I don't even remember what, and backed into the tent, fumbling to zip it shut like that would somehow keep me safe. I turned the flashlight off and sat in the dark, holding my breath. I questioned whether or not I was just jumping at shadows, that it was just raccoons running around out there, and I was just working myself up. Many minutes went by without a sound, then probably an hour. I thought it might be over. I must have dozed off, adrenaline fading and exhaustion finally catching up. Because the next thing I remember, I woke up to a faint noise just before 3 a.m. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was chanting, low, rhythmic, not loud enough to make out words, not any language I recognized, just repetition, from more than one voice, coming deep within the trees. I turned the camera on again, hit record. Didn't even speak into it this time, just pointed it at the tent wall while I listened. I swear the sounds were moving, like the voices were circling me. 1 minute to my left, the next behind me. At some point, something touched the side of the tent. Just a fingertip, it felt like. Pressing in. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat just locked. I knew then I wasn't going to make it till daylight. I made my decision fast. Threw on my boots, didn't even lace them, and stuffed the camera and flashlight in my jacket. I grabbed my phone and GPS but left everything else behind. Tent, food, gear, all of it. I unzipped the tent and bolted. Didn't even look back. I didn't run straight to the car. Some part of me knew if I made a sound, if I let them know where I was, it would all be over. So I broke into a sprint for maybe 30 yards, then veered off and climbed a small ridge I'd scouted earlier when I was filming. There was a break in the trees there, high ground with just enough elevation to see the camp if I crouched between the roots of an old cedar. From that perch, I could just make out my tent down below. The fire had burned low, embers pulsing like a dying heart. But the camp wasn't empty. They were there. All three of them. At first I thought they were just shapes, like shadows stretching weird in the moonlight. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw details. They were human, or looked it, but they moved in this awkward, theatrical way, like they were performing for something. Each of them wore dark, tattered robes or cloaks, the fabric swaying as they moved. Their faces were covered by crude masks, like papier-mâché or molded bark, rough with jagged holes where eyes should be. One of them stepped close to my tent and began pulling things out. My sleeping bag, my pack, my food, even my camera bag, tossing it all into a messy circle near the fire. Another circled the fire pit, sprinkling something from a small leather pouch. Whatever it was, it made the embers flare unnaturally, casting this weird greenish glow into the clearing. Then one of them crouched and dragged something from the dirt, something they'd made. It looked like a crude symbol, drawn with stones and sticks in a circular pattern, the same place where my tent had been. I couldn't make out the details, but it made my skin crawl. The third one just stood still, staring into the trees, head cocked like he was listening. I decided to move, slowly, quietly. But when I shifted my weight, my boot pressed against a branch. Snap. The sound cracked through the woods like a gunshot. All three figures froze. I ducked instinctively, heart punching my ribs. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. No sound. Then I peeked again. They were looking up the ridge, right at me. They couldn't possibly see me in the dark, but somehow they knew. The one with the pouch raised an arm and pointed toward my side of the ridge. No words. Just this awful, slow gesture. Then the others started climbing. They climbed faster than I expected. Their movements were wrong. jerky at first, then suddenly quick and smooth, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. I turned, ran hard, and didn't stop. My flashlight beam bounced wildly off the trees as I cut through underbrush and thorns. I slipped twice, cut my arm on something, twisted my ankle. Somewhere behind me, I heard them running too. Not yelling, not calling out, just footsteps. More than one set, gaining. I found the game trail by memory, scrambled down an embankment, crossed a shallow creek, and kept moving. I didn't stop until I saw the soft glow of a trail marker where I'd come in the day before. I was shaking, cold, but alive. I made it back to my car and peeled out of there like I was being hunted, which maybe I was. By the time I made it home, the sun was rising. I slept for maybe 2 hours before calling my dad. I didn't even tell him everything. Just said I thought someone had messed with my campsite and I wanted to grab what was left before it got stolen or rained on. He didn't ask questions. Just said he'd drive. We went back that afternoon, and on the drive, I ended up telling my dad everything. He was speechless, but he believed me. This made me feel a lot better. I knew I didn't imagine it. We trekked in the way I went before. It seemed a bit quicker getting there this time, and I felt so much safer with my dad. More so, that he decided to bring his hunting rifle along. Everything looked different in daylight. Smaller, less threatening. But the damage was real. My tent was ripped open. The ashes of my gear sat in a black ring where the fire had been. The stone pattern I'd seen was still there, half buried, shaped into a rough spiral with jagged edges, like a child's drawing of the sun. And there was something else. Hanging from a branch above the clearing was a small bundle made of twigs and hair, bound together with a strip of blackened fabric. My dad said it was probably some prank from local kids, but I knew better. It wasn't kids, and it wasn't a prank. I didn't touch anything. We just packed what little was salvageable and left. I never camped alone again. Never launched that YouTube channel either. Got a job at one of those big marketing firms that help businesses grow, producing video content and developing social media strategies. I still think about that camping trip sometimes. What those figures were doing, what they wanted. Whether it was a ritual, or a warning, or maybe an invitation. If I'm honest, I really don't ever want to know. It was more than just a cabin. It had been in the family for 3 generations, built by his grandfather, kept alive by his father, and now trusted to Caleb. Tucked deep in the Colorado backcountry, the structure sat 2 hours from any paved road and 10 minutes past the last marker on the Forest Service map. No neighbors, no service, just woods and sky and time. He drove up every summer to keep it from falling into ruin. Fix the porch, check the roof, clear the chimney. He stayed alone most trips, but this time he brought Winston, his dog, a stocky, loyal mutt who never barked at nonsense and hated being indoors. The first few days passed like they always did. Caleb chopped wood, fixed a leaky pipe, and swept out the corners. Winston sniffed every tree within a 100-yard radius. At night, they sat on the porch under black skies, the trees whispering to each other in the wind. The silence was comforting, ancient. But by the 3rd night, that silence had changed. It wasn't just quiet. It was vacant, the kind of hush that pulls everything inward, like the woods themselves had pulled a blanket over their mouth. No crickets, no owls, no wind. Just Winston, sitting stiff at the foot of the bed, ears forward, locked on the rear wall of the cabin. Caleb listened. A long minute passed. Then Winston growled. low and steady. The sound of certainty, not confusion. He stepped to the back window, lifted the curtain, saw nothing. But in the darkness beyond the tree line, there came the sound of wood striking wood. A sharp, heavy knock, then silence. His pulse thudded in his throat. He backed away, trying to explain it. Maybe a fallen branch, maybe an elk brushing a dead limb. He didn't believe a word of it. The next day, Winston stayed near the porch, ears twitching. Even the birds felt muted. That evening, Caleb secured the doors, loaded the rifle, and left a lantern burning in the front window. At 2:17 a.m., something hit the back wall. A massive, shuddering thud rattled the windows. Winston exploded into barking, teeth bared, fur rigid. Caleb was already moving, rifle in hand, heart hammering. He yanked the curtain back again. Nothing, just a darkness too thick to trust. He cracked open the front door, letting lantern lights spill onto the ground. There were no prints, no rustling, but something had been there. For the next hour, Winston stood facing the back of the cabin, body tense. Caleb didn't sleep. He sat in the rocking chair, rifle across his lap, staring out at the window like it might blink. The following afternoon, Caleb circled the cabin. 20 yards out, he found a pine tree with a long, diagonal scrape across its bark, 7 feet high, stripped clean. No claw marks, no reason. That night, the forest returned to stillness. And then, without warning, came footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They crunched over gravel and circled the cabin. Too heavy for any deer, too calculated for any bear. Then came the breath, a single huff, right outside the window. The glass fogged briefly. Winston let out a whine and slid beneath the bed. Caleb froze in place. He could feel it, the presence pressing against the wall. Not pounding, just leaning, like it was testing the structure, testing him. The wall creaked, and then it was gone. The next morning, Caleb packed without a word. He didn't eat, didn't clean. He loaded Winston into the truck and drove until the trees fell away and the cell signal returned. He didn't speak to anyone for 2 days. When his father finally called to check in, Caleb hesitated before sharing what had happened. He described the sounds, the feeling, the weight of being watched. There was a pause on the other end. Then his father said, "That happened to me once. Your grandfather, too." Caleb hasn't gone back since. Winston still perks up when they pass deep woods, still growls at empty windows when the wind dies. And some nights, Caleb dreams of standing in that cabin again, rifle in hand, walls breathing, something massive just outside. My name's Mason, and this, I'll call it hiking nightmare, happened in 2012. I lived in Boise, Idaho, and was an avid hiker at the time, with a huge emphasis on was. I explored new trails almost every weekend as I became pretty addicted to it. On this particular week, I took Friday off work and drove about 200 miles to a place I'd never been. The trail was listed on a hiking forum under one of those too vague names. Hidden Creek, North Fork Loop. A half circle of forest and ridge, running around a glacier-fed lake, only accessible by foot. I parked on the shoulder of a narrow pull-out road, gravel popping under the tires as I eased to a stop. The trailhead was just past a sagging wooden gate and a faded sign with a green U.S. Forest Service logo, but no real name. No map, just a few bullet holes in the corner of the sign and the vague sense that people didn't come here often. I stepped out of the car into that kind of silence you only get in the mountains, thick and almost alive. I was lacing up my boots when I noticed the other car. It was an older silver Subaru, parked about 30 feet down the road, nose half in a ditch. It looked like it had been there a while. Windows dusty, a few pine needles stuck to the windshield. I assumed someone else was already up on the trail until I saw her. She was leaning against the driver's side door, arms folded like she'd been waiting. She smiled when she saw me. Just a quick, polite flash. Maybe mid-30s, athletic build, dark hair pulled back, big hiking pack resting on the ground next to her. She didn't wave or call out, just kind of waited for me to say something first. I asked if she was heading out on the trail too, and she said, no, well, maybe. She'd planned to meet a friend, but the friend never showed. Said she'd been waiting for nearly an hour and was just about to give up when I pulled in. There was a pause. One of those moments where you know a question's coming before it's even spoken. Then she asked if I was hiking alone. I told her yeah, I was. Just a weekend loop. Wanted to camp near the lake, maybe do some photos. She nodded. Then she asked if I'd mind the company. I didn't know what to say at first. I mean, she seemed normal enough. Friendly. Confident. There was no awkwardness in her body language, and her pack looked like it had seen real use. I hesitated, then told her it was fine as long as she didn't mind my pace. I like to take it slow, stop for photos sometimes. She said she didn't mind, grabbed her pack, and we started walking together into the trees. We introduced ourselves after the first switchback. She said her name was Raquel. The first few miles were quiet in a good way. We didn't talk constantly, just enough to keep things from getting awkward. She mentioned she lived about 3 hours south and had been trying to get out more lately, away from the noise. I told her I worked remote most days, so a weekend offline was half necessity, half detox. We paused at a small overlook mid-morning, where the trees thinned and gave us a hazy view of the ridge ahead. I took a few photos, nothing amazing, just for memory's sake, and offered to take one of her. She politely declined, saying she never liked pictures of herself. Then, almost like an afterthought, she added that she wasn't big on social media either. Something about the way she said it stood out. Not judgmental, not shy, just final. Like the conversation didn't need to go any further. We hiked for another 20 minutes before I got that feeling. You know the one. Like something's just out of view. Like you're being watched. At first, I chalked it up to being in unfamiliar terrain, even though I wasn't technically alone. But the feeling lingered. I caught myself glancing behind us more than once. Eventually, we crossed a small stream, a rocky little dip in the trail with slick moss and a few scattered logs acting as makeshift bridges. As I stepped across, I instinctively turned back to offer Raquel a hand, and that's when I saw it. Up the hill, maybe 100 yards through the trees, someone was standing. I didn't see their face, just the shape. Male, tall, wide shoulders, wearing mismatched clothing, camo jacket, dark pants, and something that looked like a leather apron or utility belt hanging across the front. His head was covered, either a hood or long hair, I couldn't tell. He wasn't moving, just standing there, angled toward us. I blinked. My heart kicked a little. But when I looked back, he was gone. Raquel asked what was wrong. I told her I thought I saw someone. She followed my gaze, eyes scanning the hillside. When she didn't see anything, she shrugged and said it was probably a hunter. Maybe someone out checking trail cams or scouting. She said folks like that come and go all the time. I wanted to believe her. It was early fall after all, hunting season in some areas. But something about the figure, it hadn't felt like a coincidence. I nodded anyway and let it go. For now. We pressed on, deeper into the trail. The sun had shifted overhead, and the air took on that high country stillness, like the woods were holding their breath. The only sounds were the occasional bird call and the rhythmic crunch of our boots. Raquel had warmed up a little. She wasn't overly talkative, but she asked about my job, where I'd grown up. Her questions were casual, surface level, yet focused, like she was gathering a profile. We stopped at a clearing around noon, and I offered to make lunch. A small camp stove, some instant rice and tuna, nothing special. Raquel sat across from me on a fallen log, her back straight, hair pulled loose from her pack strap. She wasn't overly talkative, but there were moments, a faint smirk when I joked about my terrible camp meals, the way her eyes lingered a second too long when I looked up. That made me wonder if she was flirting or just being polite. It had been almost 2 years since my last relationship ended, and I'd convinced myself I was better off keeping to myself. But something about Raquel, the calm, the quiet steadiness, made me curious in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I told myself it was nothing, just two hikers sharing a trail and some silence. Still, when we packed up and started walking again, I caught myself watching her a moment longer than I meant to. After lunch, we descended into a shallow valley. The trail dipped toward a creek, a slow-moving, rocky stream that wound along the base of the ridge like a lazy vein. We moved quietly, the air cooler down here, dense with pine and fir. Everything felt closed in, and that's when I saw him again. Across the creek, maybe 50 yards out, behind a tree. This time I saw more detail. The man was wearing a long leather apron, like the kind a butcher might wear, or maybe a blacksmith. Camo jacket underneath, hood up, a dark beard barely visible. He wasn't moving, just watching. He had something in his hand, long, angled. I stopped cold. Raquel stepped beside me, following my gaze again. But when I pointed, the man was already gone, just like before. I asked if she'd seen him. She shook her head slowly, then said, maybe it was a hunter. Again. Her tone was flat, like she was trying not to spook me. I pressed her a little, asked if it seemed normal to her that someone would just be standing like that, in silence. Twice now, watching us. She hesitated. Then she shrugged and said it was probably nothing. Maybe someone out doing their own solo hike who got spooked by us first. It didn't feel like nothing. We crossed the creek and kept going. My pulse was still elevated. I glanced behind us every few minutes, but saw nothing. Eventually, we reached a switchback that curved up toward a higher ridge. That's when Raquel finally said something strange. She mentioned how nice it was that the trail was still quiet, even this far in. Not many people would hike this deep unless they knew exactly where they were going. It was the way she said it that stuck with me, like she wasn't surprised at all. I kept walking, but the tension never left my shoulders. Every pine needle crunch, every breeze rustling the underbrush, made my ears twitch. I wasn't having fun anymore, not even close. Raquel, meanwhile, seemed unaffected. She pointed out a patch of wildflowers, commented on the ridgeline, even suggested we push just a little farther, to a spot she said would overlook a hidden lake. That was the first time I pushed back. I told her I didn't feel right, that I'd had this weird gut feeling ever since the trailhead, that I'd seen the guy twice now, and it wasn't sitting well. Her face changed, not annoyed exactly, more like disappointed, like she thought I was being dramatic. She asked if I was scared. I didn't answer that directly. I just told her I was going to turn back. Said she could come with me or not, but I wasn't staying up here any longer than I had to. She didn't argue. Not exactly. She just stood there for a second, still as stone. Then quietly said, "You go ahead. I'll catch up." I didn't wait. I turned and started down the trail the way we came, heart thudding, watching the trees now with full awareness. Something felt cracked, wide open. Not just the man with the crossbow. Her too. 10 minutes into the descent, just before the ridge curved down toward the creek, I heard her voice echo behind me. He's getting away. It wasn't panic. It wasn't confusion. It was directive. I didn't look back. Branches tore at my sleeves as I barreled downhill, feet sliding on gravel and wet pine needles. My only goal now was distance. Just get away. That's when the first bolt hissed past me. It struck a tree just off the trail with a dead thump, clean and fast, no warning. I dropped instantly, crawling into the brush. My breathing was so loud I thought it might give me away. Somewhere uphill, I heard the rush of movement, Raquel's voice, low and urgent. Another set of footsteps joined hers, heavier, purposeful. He was real. They were both real, and they were working together. My backpack kept getting caught on branches, and it was slowing me down. I tried to power through, but it was dragging me back like a leash, so I yanked the straps off my shoulders, letting it drop into the brush. I had at least $600 invested in that pack and what was inside it, but I didn't care. I'd rather lose gear than lose my life. I kept going, half running, half falling down the switchbacks that had felt so calm and scenic on the way up. Now they were death traps, exposed and open. I could still hear movement behind me, crashing through underbrush, low grunts, and then Raquel's voice, calling my name, sweet at first, then sharper. Then came the whistling thunk of another bolt. It struck a tree just inches from me. I veered hard, nearly tumbling off the edge of a dry ravine, and slid down it, scraping my hands and arms on broken branches and thorny roots. I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every part of me screamed for oxygen, but adrenaline refused to let me slow down. Eventually, I broke through a final row of trees, and the trailhead opened up in front of me like salvation. My car sat there, untouched. I sprinted across the gravel lot, flung open the door, and got in. No hesitation, no looking back. As I fumbled the keys into the ignition, I heard something behind me. Not a shout, not a step, just breathing, heavy, close. I hit the lock button, slammed it. Then I turned the key. The engine stuttered for half a second that felt like forever, then roared to life. I backed out so fast, the tires sprayed gravel. I didn't even glance in the rear view until I was half a mile down the road. When I finally did, the trailhead was empty. But I swear, I caught a glimpse of that same pale green flannel shirt, standing just behind the tree line. When I got home, I talked to a couple of friends about my experience. I asked them if I should call the police and file a report. One of my friends didn't think it would even make a difference. Where I was hiking was very remote. No chance of there being any CCTV cameras nearby. I hadn't gotten that license plate number from Raquel's car either, if it was even her car to begin with. My friend said it could have been another victim's car. That sat with me a moment. It was then I realized how lucky I really was. But the what-ifs still haunt me. What if I hadn't noticed that man by the stream? What if I hadn't turned around when I did? What if I'd followed Raquel deeper into the woods, where cell service cuts out, and no one hears you scream? I think about that last moment, when she turned, eyes locking onto mine, and called out, "He's getting away." It wasn't shock in her voice, it was disappointment, like I'd ruined their plan. I never hike solo anymore, and I'm extremely cautious of other hikers now. I can guarantee one thing: I'll never trust anyone on the trail like that again. Tobyhanna, Pennsylvania is one of those in-between places, not rural enough to feel untouched, not urban enough to feel safe. Patches of new development interrupt swaths of thick green belt, and the woods behind every house seem deeper than they should be. Adam Keller hadn't been back in years. His childhood home had long since been sold, but his uncle's property still sat tucked at the end of an old gravel road, pressed up against protected forest land. The house was shuttered for winter, pipes drained, windows latched. But Adam had a long weekend and a key. He told himself he was going up to split wood and check for storm damage. Really, he was just looking for a place to get lost. The first day passed uneventfully. He swept out the dust, checked the gutters, started the generator to charge his phone and boil coffee. He walked the property line before dusk and listened to the creak of trees flexing in the cold. The silence was immediate and thick. There were no distant lawnmowers, no traffic drones, just forest, untamed and wide. By the second afternoon, Adam was hiking farther into the woods than he remembered going as a kid. The trails were less defined now, more suggestion than structure. Fallen trees blocked the old paths. Thick moss softened every footstep. He passed a long-forgotten stone wall, crumbling into the brush, then another, running parallel. Some old farmer's idea of order, now swallowed by green. It was past that second wall, in a low depression beneath a ridge, where the air shifted. The quiet turned dense, not peaceful, but oppressive. The birds had vanished. Even the distant tapping of woodpeckers was gone. It was like walking into a soundproofed room in the middle of the forest. No wind, no insects, just the soft crunch of his boots against frostbitten leaves. And even that sounded wrong, as if muffled under heavy cloth. He paused to check his bearings, suddenly uncertain how far he'd come. The trees ahead grew in rigid lines, unnaturally uniform, all thin-trunked and pale like bone. The ground sloped gently but steadily, and the light had taken on a strange tint, gray-green and watery. The air smelled different here, not unpleasant, but strange. Damp earth mixed with mildew, touched with something faintly sour. A faint smell of something left too long in the dark. He considered turning back, but a pull, part curiosity, part instinct, urged him forward. Each step felt like stepping into thicker air, as if the forest itself resisted him. Then the trail abruptly vanished, swallowed by root clusters and hanging ferns. When he turned to retrace his steps, the path looked unfamiliar, less like something made by feet, more like something pushed through once, long ago. That's when he heard it. It started low, not a sound exactly, but a feeling. A slow, crushing hum that made his spine tighten and the hairs on his arms lift. Then, from deep within the trees, something roared. It was not an animal's cry. It wasn't wind or machinery. It was too big for the forest. The sound surged upward, deep and resonant, until it became a deafening scream. One that didn't echo, but seemed to press in from every direction, vibrating through his chest like a passing train. And just as suddenly as it started, it stopped, cut off in the middle of its own breath, as if something enormous had snapped its mouth shut. The stillness that followed was unbearable. He stood frozen, eyes locked on the trees ahead, expecting motion, expecting anything. But nothing moved. Not a branch, not a bird. It was like the world had held its breath and hadn't decided whether to exhale. When he could move again, he didn't think. He just turned and ran. His boots skidded across wet stone. Thorns scraped his arms, and the forest felt tighter with every step. The deeper quiet seemed to follow him, curling around his shoulders like invisible arms. He stumbled once and caught himself on a moss-slick boulder, palms stinging from the cold. It was nearly dark by the time he reached the house. The last of the sun lit the roof line like an ember. He shut the door hard and locked it without even realizing his hand had moved. The silence came with him. That night, the generator sputtered and cut out. He sat in the living room by a lantern light, wrapped in his coat, not reading, not moving, just listening. Around 2 a.m., he heard it again. Not the roar, not the hum, just one sound. A single footstep, heavy and deliberate, pressed into the gravel just outside the side window. Not pacing, not circling, just a presence, placing itself where he could hear it. He didn't sleep after that. When dawn came, pale and slow, he packed what he could and left everything else behind. No breakfast, no cleanup. He was on the road before the frost melted. No one else reported anything unusual in Tobyhanna that week. No power surges, no missing pets, no unexplained noises. Just another cold snap and the forest closing in. Later, when asked, Adam struggled to describe what he heard. He used words like mechanical, throaty, and too close. He said it sounded like something trying not to be noticed, but failing in the loudest possible way. He never went back to his uncle's cabin, and whatever made that sound never showed itself. It didn't have to. Being heard was enough. My name is Ryan, and this happened in late September of 2021 in Olympic National Forest. My fiancée Maya and I have hiked those trails for years. We don't consider ourselves experts, but we know the terrain, the sounds, the patterns of the forest. We've had close calls with wildlife and storms, but nothing truly frightening, nothing that ever stuck with us after the hike was over. Everything changed that afternoon. It was a short, late-day trip. We had dinner plans in town afterward, so we didn't pack the things we normally bring. No spray, no multi-tool, no first aid kit. For once, we treated the trail like something routine, a quick in and out to clear our heads before the evening. The hike began, like any other autumn transition day, in the Pacific Northwest. The air carried the first hints of the cold season, and the canopy let in that soft golden light that only happens when summer is losing its grip. The forest felt quiet in the normal way, a peaceful hush, the kind that settles when the weekend crowds thin and only a handful of hikers move through the deeper trails. We crossed the small footbridge and rounded the bend where the larger Sitka spruce leans over the path. That was where we first saw the woman. She stood slightly off the trail near the fallen log, her posture rigid and her face turned downward. She wasn't breaking down loudly or calling for help. Her crying was soft, a fragile, subdued sound, almost like she was trying not to draw attention to herself. Her hands hung at her sides. She didn't wipe her face or cover her eyes. She just stood there, facing nothing, crying in a way that felt unsettlingly detached. A few yards ahead, a man in a blue hoodie had his back turned toward us. He was pushing a stroller down the rocky incline that branches off to the right. Anyone familiar with Skokomish trails would know how strange that was. Roots, rocks, uneven terrain. Nothing about that section accommodates a stroller. It was an image that didn't belong there. We continued past them without engaging. Neither of them reacted to our presence. The woman stayed perfectly still. The man kept pushing the stroller as if he didn't notice the difficulty of the terrain. Maya and I exchanged a look that said we had walked into something uncomfortable and didn't want to get involved. At the time, it felt like the right choice. We kept going until hunger finally pushed us to turn around earlier than planned. The forest was beginning to darken slightly, and the air had that shift you feel when daylight is beginning to fade behind the treetops. Not enough to make you rush, but enough to remind you the window is closing. On our way back, we saw the man again. This time, the woman was nowhere in sight. The man was still pushing the stroller, though now he was closer to the main path. As we passed, I instinctively glanced down into the stroller. It was empty. No blanket, no toys, no baby. Just leaves, dirt, and an old scuff mark on the inner padding. Something about that empty stroller hit me like cold air. My mind tried to reason through it. Maybe he had set the baby down earlier. Maybe the woman had taken the child. Maybe we had misread the situation. But nothing made sense. Without thinking, I commented quietly to Maya, believing we were far enough away to be unheard. My tone must have changed in a way she recognized, because she tensed and subtly urged me to keep walking. She leaned slightly toward me and implied that the man had heard what I said, then mentioned that his head had turned toward us sharply. I did not look back right away. Something in the atmosphere, some instinct, told me that seeing his face would make everything worse. Instead, I kept my eyes forward and tried to quicken my pace naturally. Then I heard it. Footsteps behind us. Steady at first, then faster, closing the distance. He was following us. Maya's posture shifted from tense to alarmed, and I didn't need to see her expression to know the situation had changed. Every few seconds, one of us looked back just long enough to confirm the man was still there, always at the same distance, always moving with a purposeful speed that didn't match a normal hiker's rhythm. When we passed the place where the crying woman had been, she was standing there again, or maybe she had never left. But this time she wasn't crying. She stared at the ground with the same blank, lifeless stillness of a mannequin. No emotion. No acknowledgement of the man behind us. The moment I saw her, every instinct I had told me that something was terribly wrong. Not strange, not uncomfortable, dangerous. I guided Maya ahead and felt the creeping panic rise in my chest. We maintained a fast walk until Maya's breathing quickened and the forest sounds behind us shifted from footsteps to full-on pursuit. There's a moment during fear when thought disappears and instinct takes over. That moment hit us both at the exact same time. We ran. Branches tore at our legs. The gravel underfoot slipped, and my heartbeat pounded so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Behind us, the man's footsteps grew louder and faster. No hesitation, just raw pursuit. Every time the trail curved and we briefly lost sight of him, a flash of blue reappeared a second later through the trees. The forest, which moments earlier had felt familiar and safe, now felt like it was closing around us. The air felt too thin, the silence too complete between our panicked breaths. Finally, after what felt like 10 full minutes of sprinting, the trail widened and we saw 3 hikers up ahead, a group of middle-aged backpackers with trekking poles and large packs. The moment we reached them, something shifted behind us. I turned around slowly. The man was gone. Not out of sight. Gone. No cracking branches, no retreating footsteps, no sound of someone hiding off trail. Just empty woods. We stayed with the other hikers until we reached the lot. They noticed our panic and kept a casual but concerned distance, the way strangers do when they sense something is wrong, but don't want to pry. When we reached the parking area, Maya and I practically threw ourselves into the car. I drove out so fast, I kicked gravel behind us. We said nothing for a long time afterward. The fear traveled with us all the way down the forest road. A few days later, I found myself unable to shake it. The encounter played on repeat in my head. The crying woman, the man, the empty stroller, the pursuit, the way he vanished. I convinced myself to go back alone, not to the same trailhead, but to the visitor's center near Lake Cushman. I told myself I just wanted information, maybe reassurance that what we experienced wasn't as dangerous as it felt. A ranger behind the counter asked what he could help with. I explained what happened, carefully leaving out the panic and focusing on the facts. The strange behavior of the couple on the trail, the empty stroller, the man following us. The ranger's expression didn't change much, but there was a flicker behind his eyes, the kind you see when someone recognizes something they hoped not to hear about again. He asked what trail we'd been on. When I answered, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He didn't tell me I had imagined it. He didn't tell me it was normal. He didn't tell me we misunderstood a harmless situation. He simply said that people sometimes behave strangely in the backcountry, and that hikers should always carry protection and be aware of their surroundings. Then he suggested, with an oddly firm tone, that Maya and I avoid that section of the forest for a while. What struck me wasn't what he said. It was what he refused to say. His posture stiffened when I mentioned the crying woman. He grew noticeably uncomfortable when I described the stroller. And when I admitted the man had followed us, he lowered his voice slightly and said that if we ever saw anything like that again, we should return to the trailhead immediately and not confront or engage. I left the center with the overwhelming sense that the ranger knew more than he allowed himself to reveal. That this wasn't the first report of something like this. A week later, Maya and I returned, not to hike deeply, but to walk a short loop near the lake. We stayed on a populated trail with other people around. It felt safer that way. But even there, we found something unsettling. A tiny baby sock lay in the middle of the path. A few feet later, a small knit hat. Then, near a mossy stump, a onesie half covered in pine needles. No families nearby, no strollers, no voices, nothing. Just those small, scattered pieces. Each time, the same cold feeling crawled up my spine, the exact feeling I had the moment I saw the empty stroller. I can't explain any of it. I don't know who that man was. I don't know why the woman cried the way she did. I don't know where the stroller went or why the ranger reacted the way he did. All I know is that something in those woods is very wrong. It's been almost exactly 10 years since one of the strangest disappearances in Adirondack history, the vanishing of 82-year-old hunter Tom Messick. On November 15, 2015, Messick and 6 other men set out for a routine deer hunt near Lily Pond, just west of Brant Lake, New York. They were experienced outdoorsmen, veterans of both the woods and of life itself. But before that day was over, one of them would be gone without a trace. What makes this case so haunting isn't just the mystery, it's the silence that followed. 7 men drove deep into the woods near Lily Pond, just west of Brant Lake. They were all experienced hunters, men who'd spent their lives in these forests. Among them was Tom Messick, 82 years old, a retired Air Force paratrooper who'd been hunting since he was a boy. Tom wasn't the type to take chances. He'd lost sight in one eye and some hearing in one ear, but he knew his limits. He knew these woods better than most. His son, Dennis, was with him that day, part of a group that had hunted together for decades. The plan was routine, a drive hunt. Half the men would walk a wide arc through the timber, pushing deer toward the others who waited along a ridge. Tom's position was simple. He'd been dropped off near the edge of an old logging road to sit and wait. He had his rifle, his radio, a small metal bucket he used as a seat. He wore his blaze orange vest, bright enough to see through the trees from half a mile away. By 10 o'clock that morning, the men had spread out and the hunt was underway. By noon, Tom Messick was gone. When the group finished their first pass through the woods and began regrouping, they expected to see Tom near the road where he'd been posted. But his spot was empty. His son called his name. Nothing. They looked for boot prints, broken branches, anything disturbed. There was none of it. His radio was silent. His seat was missing. His rifle was gone. At first, they thought maybe he'd walked toward the sound of the movement or tried to get a better view. But the terrain was thick, the ridgeline steep. Tom wasn't one to wander, especially not with bad knees and failing eyesight. By early afternoon, worry had turned to alarm. By sunset, it was fear. When you've hunted together as long as they had, you know what makes sense and what doesn't. And this didn't. Authorities were called that evening. The Warren County Sheriff's Office and New York State DEC responded quickly, setting up a search command post near Lily Pond Road. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging were brought in. Search dogs were deployed. Dozens of trained personnel worked through the night. In the following days, the effort grew into one of the largest missing person searches the Adirondacks had ever seen. More than 300 volunteers and professionals scoured nearly 50 square miles of wilderness. They searched ravines and ridgelines, old logging trails and beaver ponds. They found nothing. No footprints, no blood, no drag marks, no torn fabric from his blaze orange. A veteran searcher said later, "In 30 years, I've never seen a case give us so little. And still, every single day ended the same way, cold, quiet, and empty-handed." The search itself became a kind of living organism, growing, shifting, and adapting with each passing day. By the second morning, the trailhead off Lily Pond Road looked less like a remote hunting pull-off and more like a forward operating camp. Trucks lined the shoulder. Portable generators hummed. Folding tables were covered with maps, marked in red grease pencil, grids showing areas cleared, areas still to be searched, and those too rugged to risk sending volunteers into. Searchers were divided into small teams: rangers, deputies, local hunters, and volunteer firefighters. Each carried radios, GPS units, compasses, and fluorescent ribbons to mark their paths. It was standard protocol, slow, methodical, overlapping sweeps designed to cover every inch of ground. They started closest to the last known position and worked outward, a spiral of orange vests moving through brush and deadfall. The rhythm was deliberate. One man calls, the next repeats, ensuring no voice is lost to the woods. But the forest in that part of the southern Adirondacks has a way of swallowing sound. Radios crackled with half-sentences. Static bled over transmissions. Voices that should have carried 100 yards sometimes vanished entirely. Helicopters circled overhead during daylight hours, their rotors thumping low and heavy through the trees. From above, the canopy looked like a wrinkled green ocean, dense, uneven, and unforgiving. Thermal imaging cameras scanned for heat signatures, but the results came back blank. By midweek, even the most seasoned rescuers began to show it. That quiet fatigue you only see when professionalism gives way to disbelief. They had followed every rule, every pattern. They knew how to find a lost person. But this wasn't that. One ranger described it later. It was like we were searching for a ghost. We had the coordinates. We had his photo. But it felt like he wasn't in this world anymore. People who were there say the woods felt different that week. The sound just stopped. Even the birds seemed to disappear. Some of the search dogs, normally eager and steady, began behaving strangely. They'd freeze mid-step or refuse to move deeper into the woods. One handler said it was as if they'd hit an invisible wall. At night, when the searchers returned to camp, that quiet followed them. They'd sit by their trucks, staring into the trees, unwilling to say it out loud, but all thinking the same thing. How can a man just vanish? And then came the whispers. Small at first, spreading quietly through nearby towns and hunting circles. Some locals wondered if Tom had even been there at all. It sounded ridiculous at first, almost disrespectful. But it came from a place of confusion. How could so many people search so thoroughly for so long and find absolutely nothing? If someone truly disappears, shouldn't something remain? A shell casing, a boot print, a torn glove? It led to one uncomfortable question. Could a mistake have been made early on? Could Tom have stayed closer to the trucks or never reached his assigned spot at all? Those who knew him best, his son, his friends, shut that idea down quickly. They'd seen him take his post. He'd checked in over the radio just before the drive began. He was there. But when logic fails, people reach for whatever's left. And for some, that meant wondering if the story had started from the wrong place entirely. One of the hunters later spoke about something strange he'd heard that morning. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't gunfire. He described it as a single metallic snap, like a massive trap closing somewhere deep in the trees. It echoed once, then vanished into silence. No one else heard it. No explanation was ever found. There were no traps in the area, no equipment, no metal debris. Just that one sound, sharp, unnatural, and final. When weeks passed with no discovery, interest in the case spread. One researcher, known for studying clusters of wilderness disappearances across North America, quietly added Messick's name to his list. The details fit a pattern. Experienced outdoorsman, often older, vanishing without trace, sometimes within sight of their group, often under strange conditions. In many of these cases, there were shared details: unusual silences, electrical interference, sudden changes in weather, or mechanical sounds no one could explain. Nothing could be proven, but it was enough to make some wonder if what happened in those woods wasn't unique. As the official search wound down, the story started moving beyond Brant Lake, picked up by regional papers and true crime circles online. For a while, the headlines were simple: elderly hunter missing in Adirondacks. But as the days turned to weeks, the tone began to shift. Locals near Warrensburg and Chestertown started sharing older stories, quiet disappearances that never made front pages but lived on in campfire talk. There was the trapper who vanished near Faro Lake in the 1960s, whose canoe was later found overturned in shallow water with his gear still inside. There was the hiker from the 1980s who walked off a marked trail in the Siamese Ponds wilderness and was never seen again. And further north, near Whitehall, a series of strange sightings from the 1970s that blurred the line between folklore and police reports. None of them were proven connected, but people noticed patterns: solitude, silence, sudden vanishings in clear daylight. Hunters who'd spent decades navigating these mountains began saying they wouldn't go near Lily Pond anymore. Not because they believed in monsters or portals or anything out of a movie, but because something about the place felt wrong now. One local put it simply: when the woods stop talking, that's when you leave. Dennis Messick didn't want speculation. He wanted answers. "My father didn't just wander off," he said. "If something happened, I would have heard it." Locals near Brant Lake still talk about it. Some say they don't hunt that area anymore. Others say the woods feel heavier now. There are no warning signs, no closed trails, but the story travels on its own. Among men who've hunted their entire lives, it's become a quiet rule: don't go near Lily Pond alone. One of Tom's longtime friends summed it up best when asked what he believed happened. He looked at the ground and said, "The mountain took him." Even years later, the silence surrounding the case feels heavier than the facts themselves. People who were part of that original search say they still think about it when the wind dies down, when the forest feels too still. One volunteer, now retired, said there were moments during the search when the quiet was so complete that you could hear your own heartbeat in your ears. Another said he started humming just to make noise, because the stillness felt like pressure. A few have their theories. Some say Tom fell into an old, unmapped well or sinkhole, concealed by leaves and brush, though no such hazards were ever found. Others talk about the sound the hunters heard that morning, the metallic snap that never fit any natural explanation. And then there are those who lean towards something less tangible, that certain places hold on to what enters them, the way the mountains seem to remember. When all is said and done, this case comes down to one thing: absence. No gear, no tracks, no evidence of a struggle. An experienced hunter vanished within earshot of 6 others on a clear morning, and there's been no trace of him since. Some say the forest hides what it takes. Others think there was something mechanical in that sound, a door closing, a machine, something human-made. And a few still whisper the strangest theory of all, that Tom Messick was never there. Over the years, people have argued about what happened near Lily Pond Road. Some blame the terrain, others an accident no one witnessed. And a few still wonder if the answer lies in that single metallic sound, the one that didn't belong. What's certain is this: no trace of Tom Messick has ever been found. Hundreds looked and found nothing. And until something surfaces, the woods will keep their secret. In the spring of 2002, the forests of Tequamanon Falls State Park became the backdrop of a terrifying experience for 2 recent medical graduates. Mariah Cooper, 28, and her friend Hannah McCrary, 27, set out on what was meant to be a celebratory camping trip, commemorating their hard-earned degrees. Instead, their long-awaited adventure morphed into an unimaginable nightmare. This unbelievable tale serves as a cautionary reminder of the importance of safety awareness while camping in the vast wilderness. Mariah Cooper and Hannah McCrary met during their college journey in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and became fast friends. They discovered they both had a lot of common interests, including their love for hiking and nature itself. They often spent the weekends exploring various trails in and around some of Michigan's beautiful wooded landscapes. Excited to celebrate their graduation, the 2 women planned a getaway to the beautiful remote vistas of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Known for its lush forests and stunning waterfalls, the Tequamanon State Park seemed like the perfect escape. It had been on their bucket list for some time, so they couldn't wait to finally make it a reality. Little did they know, their trip would descend into the most frightful event of their lives, one that would end with only one of them living to tell the tale. On May 31st, 2002, Hannah and Mariah made the 5-hour drive from Grand Rapids to Tequamanon State Park in Hannah's new red Honda Civic, a graduation gift from her parents. They listened to their favorite music, laughed, and talked about their upcoming weekend before arriving at the Lower Falls parking lot around 4 p.m. Surprisingly, there were no other cars in the area. With a few hours of daylight left, they wanted to get to the backcountry campsite near Clark Lake so they could set up their camp and enjoy the sunset. After double-checking their backpacks, the 2 of them began their 3-day adventure on the Upper and Lower Falls Trail. A couple of hours later, they arrived at Clark Lake. It was as beautiful as the pictures they had seen on the internet. They took some time taking their own photos with Mariah's old-school Polaroid camera she borrowed from her mother. Taking selfies was a bit of a challenge since cell phones with cameras hadn't quite made their introduction. After setting up camp and starting a fire, they cooked dinner and enjoyed the setting sun while chatting about life, relationships, and of course the next chapter of their new careers. Before they turned in and retreated to their tent, Mariah stepped away to relieve herself while Hannah cleaned up camp and placed their extra food items in a nearby bear box. Both were seasoned campers and fully understood the prudence of using the buddy system, whether in the wilderness or at the many college parties and nightclubs they attended while they were in school. When Mariah was walking back to camp, she noticed how quiet the forest had become and realized she hadn't heard or seen much wildlife since they had arrived. Oddly, she couldn't remember seeing any other people on the trail either. Later, as they nestled in their tent, Mariah zipped the tent closed, commenting on how much chillier it had gotten, then asked Hannah if she remembered seeing anyone else since they'd arrived, but she couldn't recall. They joked about not getting too creeped out of the possibility of being alone in the entire park, as it was unlikely to be the case, being they were on the cusp of summer. To calm any unspoken fears, they talked about the day ahead and the memories they would make before falling asleep. The next morning, the women woke to the sound of the trees blowing in the breeze. It felt abnormally frigid, despite staying bundled in their sleeping bags. Something didn't feel quite right, and when they sat up, they understood why, as their eyes adjusted to a troubling sight. Their tent was completely unzipped. They looked at each other in unison, eyes wide. Did one of them wake in the middle of the night to pee and forget to close it? Hannah quickly stated it wasn't her. She was about to ask Mariah the same thing, but before she could get the words out, Mariah shook her head no. Both undoubtedly recalled Mariah zipping the tent shut before they bedded down. Their hearts dropped to the pit of their stomach when they came to the realization that someone or something had opened their tent in the middle of the night. After getting dressed, Hannah and Mariah sipped coffee and ate granola. They tried to soothe each other's fears by presenting any other possibilities that could have resulted in their tent being opened, knowing in their hearts it could only be the most obvious. Once they packed up camp, they began the next 7-mile leg of their hike, hoping they could forget the unsettling feeling weighing on their minds. For a while, they walked in silence, looking over their shoulders and attempting to stay alert of their surroundings. After a mile or two, they arrived at a beautiful waterfall. The gorgeous view calmed their troubled spirits. They took more photos and tried to forget the morning's events. After eating a snack and rehydrating, Hannah and Mariah hopped back on the trail. Mariah bent down to retie her hiking boot. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a twig break deep in the woods. She snapped her head toward the noise. About 30 yards into the forest, she noticed what looked like a bending or refracting of light. Thinking it was just a mote in her eye, she rubbed it, then blinked a few times. But it was still there. Then it shifted behind a tree and disappeared. Mariah jogged a bit to catch up to Hannah and asked if she'd heard the sound, but she hadn't. Both agreed that Mariah was still a bit jumpy from what happened earlier. However, Mariah kept what she saw to herself and secretly hid her rising inner feeling they were being watched. The rest of the day was uneventful, and around 3 p.m. they arrived at their next campsite near the Tequamanon River. Mariah began pitching their tent as Hannah walked the perimeter, gathering firewood. Mariah kept her sights on Hannah, making a concerted effort to stay cognizant of their environment. Meanwhile, Hannah sauntered through the grass at the edge of the tree line, holding a handful of wood. As she bent down to pick up one last piece, a deer bolted out of the woods, startling her, causing her to drop her plunder. She shrieked and held her chest tightly, watching the deer run across the open area of the campsite. She noticed Mariah watching as well. They both acknowledged each other and smiled in response. When Hannah bent down to gather the scattered firewood, she heard more rustling in the distant foliage. She scanned the area expecting another deer, and to her disbelief, she noticed something she couldn't explain. It appeared to be a transparent blob-like figure resting into a still position, as if slowing to a stop. Hannah squinted, holding her gaze on whatever it was. She blinked and it was gone. Her eyes darted back and forth, trying to locate it again, but she couldn't see it. Like Mariah, she too felt like she was being watched. She trotted back to Mariah, who was just finishing up the tent, and tossed the wood on the ground. Mariah started to mention the deer, but Hannah quickly interrupted her, telling her she saw something in the woods she couldn't explain. After a beat of silence, Mariah shared what she had seen back at the waterfall. Trying to make sense of it, Hannah described it as being camouflaged, looking similar to the creature from a movie she saw with her brother when she was 14, called Predator, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. Mariah had seen the same movie and agreed that no matter how silly it sounded, it was the most accurate description. The women were beside themselves and wondered if the deer that startled Hannah and ran out of the woods was running from what they saw. Was whoever or whatever it was responsible for opening their tent? They thought they could have been overreacting, allowing their imaginations to run wild, but they reassured each other they weren't crazy. Far from it. They were medical grads, for goodness sake, with official letters that came after their names. Suddenly, a whistling sound came from the direction of the tree line, but it didn't sound like a bird. It was more like someone signaling someone else. Both acknowledged the situation felt increasingly uneasy and didn't sit right with either of them. The growing impression of being stalked had become a very real possibility. Hannah quickly grabbed her backpack and dug out her Nokia cell phone and noticed the battery was almost dead. Plus, there was no service, which was not really a surprise considering where they were. In that moment, she remembered she had forgotten to call her parents to let them know they had made it to the park. Mariah checked her cell phone as well, but with the same result: no service. Their instinct for self-preservation set in. Without haste, they decided to pack up and try to hike out of the park, knowing that reaching Hannah's car before dark would be a tall order, since the sun was already going down. They figured if they moved at a rapid pace, they'd make it to Hannah's car by roughly 9 p.m. Darkness descended upon the park, and it was becoming a little harder to see. As they made their way swiftly down the trail, they took small breaks for water. Their fears intensified, a feeling that crescendoed as time passed. Without warning, Mariah stumbled and fell to the ground, holding her ankle. Hannah dropped her pack and rushed to her aid. That's when they noticed what Mariah had tripped over. A deer was lying slightly off the path, with an arrow sticking out of its neck. They wondered if it was the same deer they saw before. Regardless, hunting season was still months away. This fueled their growing distress. As Hannah helped Mariah to her feet, they heard a swish sound, like something cutting through the air. Without warning, an arrow burst through the front of Hannah's thigh, spurting blood onto Mariah's face. Hannah screamed in pain and fell to the ground. Mariah moved to help her, and quickly noticed some sort of cable attached to the back of the arrow sticking out of Hannah's leg. She examined it closer and realized the arrow wasn't your normal wooden arrow. This one was made out of solid metal material. Mariah tried her best to focus on any medical training she could remember, but like Hannah, she was also in shock. Neither one of them had any real trauma experience. Then, another sound emerged that could only be described as a high-pitched winch or fishing reel. Suddenly, Hannah's body jolted and was dragged off the trail and into the forest. Mariah gave chase. She dove and grabbed Hannah's hand, but her grip wasn't strong enough, and Hannah slipped away, pulled into the forest, her screams echoing in darkness. Mariah pulled herself off the ground and realized there was nothing more she could do. She needed to get to Hannah's car if there was any chance of getting help. She rummaged through Hannah's backpack and took her keys. As she stood, another arrow zipped past Mariah, barely missing her, striking a nearby tree. That one came from the opposite side of the trail. In that moment, she realized whoever or whatever was out there, there were two of them. Mariah bolted from the scene back to the trail and ran as fast as she could. Her survival mode set in, and her adrenaline pumped so hard that she forgot about her ankle. The only thing she could think of was, could she make it to the car before she was taken out? She cried as she ran, thinking of her best friend and the horror that had unfolded. She could hear the whistling she heard earlier that day, but she didn't look back. She ran faster and faster until she could see the streetlight coming from the parking lot. Her plan was to drive out of the park as fast as she could and call 911 as soon as she had service on her cell phone. Mariah arrived at Hannah's car exhausted, out of breath, but also relieved. But her relief was short-lived. When she approached the Honda Civic, her heart sank when she noticed all 4 tires were slashed. She pulled out her cell phone, but barely had any battery life. She tried 911, but still didn't have service. Hopeless and out of options, she made the decision to head out of the park on foot. Moments later, a forest ranger approached in a state park SUV. Mariah waved him down and explained what had happened. The ranger took Mariah to safety, and a massive search for Hannah was immediately launched. State, local, and federal authorities were involved. Mariah and Hannah's family arrived the next day, but authorities kept them out of the search area to prevent the search and rescue dogs from confusing their scents. Mariah returned with investigators to where the women were attacked and was able to point out the tree with markings of where an arrowhead piece had been pulled from the bark. Unfortunately, The dead deer she tripped over could not be located. 2 days passed and no trace of Hannah could be found. Despite very few clues, there remained a shadow of skepticism regarding Mariah's account. Authorities could not locate any other evidence of the person or persons whom she claimed had stalked them, leading some to question the validity of her story. That a figure, dressed in camouflage that resembled a creature from a sci-fi film, hunted them like animals. Mariah knew it sounded crazy, but she was consistent in her story. A few weeks later, back home in Grand Rapids, Mariah was going through her backpack and pulled out the Polaroid photos her and Hannah had taken before their trip turned for the worst. As she flipped through them, she cried at the thought of her friend being taken, being pulled into that wooded abyss. Studying one of the selfies they had taken by the lake, she noticed something chilling in the background. It was what appeared to be the camouflaged figure crouching near the tree line. She submitted the photo to authorities, but according to investigators, they shrugged it off as a lighting artifact of the lens due to some overexposure in the picture. In October, only 4 months later, a middle-aged couple was hiking off trail with their English Springer Spaniel into Quamanon State Park. During their hike, the dog began sniffing and barking at some underbrush in a clearing where they had stopped to eat lunch. The couple went to see what was causing the dog to react in this way, and when they inspected the area, one of them stepped on what sounded like metal. They wiped away some of the dirt and leaves and discovered a metal door with a handle. They lifted the door and swung it open, revealing a grisly sight. It appeared to be an abandoned man-made bunker, roughly 7 feet deep. The couple marked the area, left the park, and called the sheriff. Authorities arrived and conducted a thorough investigation. What they uncovered not only validated Mariah's story, but it would haunt those that visit the state park for years to come. The underground bunker contained 5 human skeletons hanging on the walls, displayed like trophies, an extremely disturbing sight that rivaled the scariest of horror films. Even more puzzling were 2 military-grade ghillie suits, fashioned with diamond-shaped mirror pieces covering them from top to bottom. When the suits were examined, they appeared to be very well designed and looked almost invisible to the naked eye in almost any environment, again confirming what Mariah perpetuated. In addition to the suits, metal arrowhead pieces were collected that matched the markings in the tree, near where the incident had taken place, and exactly as Mariah had described in her statements. When the coroner's office studied the skeletal remains, they were able to identify 3 out of the 5 corpses. Sadly, one was identified to be that of Hannah McCrary. Due to the extreme decomposition of the remains, causes of death were undetermined. The families didn't know how to process the horrifying news. As for the other 2 Jane Does, they continued to be a mystery. Those close to the investigation asked the questions: were the suits constructed by a secret military program in which the women became unwitting participants in a dark black ops experiment? Or were the perpetrators just a couple of criminally insane individuals playing a sick game of hunting human beings for sport? Whoever stalked and hunted Mariah and Hannah in Michigan's Upper Peninsula was never found, as the case has remained open until any new leads emerge. Hannah McCrary's family erected a memorial in her name and the others who were lost in the Tequamanon State Park. Mariah visits the memorial every year with Hannah's family on the anniversary of their fateful trip, to remember her best friend and the wonderful memories they shared. My name is Patrick, and after what happened 2 winters ago, I will never hike Ireland's northern coastline at night again. I've lived in this country my entire life, and I've always thought of the coast as something familiar. Wild, yes, but comforting. Something ancient and steady. After that night, I don't see it the same way. About 3 years ago, I moved up to the very top of Ireland, County Donegal. More specifically, a little place called Port Carrig, a windswept coastal town tucked between cliffs, farmland, and miles of nothing. It was everything I thought I wanted after leaving Dublin. Quiet, rugged, close to the sea. But the further north you go, the more the coastline feels different, like it isn't really meant for people. When I first settled in, I spent nearly every weekend hiking the cliff trails around Hornhead. Green cliffs, narrow paths, the Atlantic crashing below. You feel small in the best way. After a year of living there, I started pushing myself farther. More remote sections of the coastline, places locals only ever mentioned in passing. That December, right before Christmas, I decided I wanted to hike the Eastern Trail farther than I had ever gone before. The forecast was clear, the tides were favorable, and I had the day off. So I packed a small lunch, filled my thermos, and headed out just before sunrise. The hike was incredible at first. Cold wind, gray water, endless cliffs. Hours passed without me seeing a single person. At one point, the trail dipped into a sheltered valley, and I came across what looked like an old, abandoned port village. Tumbled stone cottages, a ruined roundhouse, and scraps of rusted metal that might have once been part of fishing gear. Later, I learned it was an old heritage site, but at the time, it felt like stumbling onto a forgotten settlement swallowed by the coastline. Past that, I saw the distant cliffs of Dunbrannock. They were massive, far larger than the cliffs I had already hiked. Even though my legs were starting to ache, I told myself I would reach them. Just touch the base and turn back. That was the plan. In hindsight, this was the point where I should have stopped, because night fell faster than I expected. By the time I crossed the bay and started heading back, the coastline was already choked in darkness. The tide was still low, but I knew I didn't have long. Certain parts of the trail flood quickly, cutting off escape. So I kept my phone low to the sand, following my own footprints. That's when I saw the first shape, a dark mound in the sand about 20 yards ahead. My beam barely reached it. At first I thought it was driftwood, or a boulder washed in by a storm. Something wasn't right about it, though. The shape felt slumped. As I got closer, the smell hit me. A dense, metallic rot, the kind that sticks to the back of your throat. Not the typical salty decay of a fish carcass. This was warmer, heavier, almost sweet in the worst possible way. It made my eyes water. I nudged the shape with the toe of my boot. It gave under the pressure. Soft, wet. My stomach clenched. I forced my flashlight onto it. It was a seal pup, and it was wrong. A near-perfect circular bite had been taken out of its side. Not ragged, not torn, clean, too clean. But the worst part wasn't the wound. It was the head. The skin of the head was intact, lying flat like a collapsed hood, but the entire skull was gone, cleanly missing. The skin looked as if it had been emptied. The smell coming off it was sour and thick, like old blood and warm copper left too long in the sun. Even the cold December air couldn't mask it. Swallowing hard, I backed away and kept walking. Maybe 10 minutes later, I found the second one. Same shape, same smell, same circular bite, same emptied skin where the skull should have been. Identical. It was like someone had stamped them from a mold. I felt the hair on my arms rise. I looked inland toward the dark wall of the dunes and grasses, suddenly aware of how quiet everything was. No wind, no waves close enough to hear, just my breathing. Then from somewhere up on the dunes to my right, I heard something that froze me in place. A giggle, high at first, then dropping low. Not a child's giggle, a man's, but not quite right. Sharp in some places, slurred in others, like someone trying to mimic laughter without understanding how it works. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The dunes went dead silent again. My throat closed. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam died in the blackness. Nothing moved. Nothing shifted. But I suddenly felt watched. intensely watched, like something crouched just out of the light's reach, grinning. I didn't run. Not yet. Running on wet sand in the dark is a good way to break your ankle and drown under a rising tide. But I walked faster. Much faster. Several minutes later, the giggle came again. Farther away this time, but unmistakably the same voice. Short, mocking, almost playful. That was the moment I realized something was pacing me along the dark dunes. Something that had been close enough earlier to possibly leave two identical carcasses in my path, and close enough now to let me hear it. I didn't think. I just started running. I didn't stop until I saw the faint lights of Port Carrig in the distance. By the time I got home, I was shaking so badly I could barely turn my key in the door. People have told me for years that seals lose their heads in the surf. That bite marks can look identical. That scavengers can drag bodies. That wind can create strange echoes. Maybe they're right. But none of that explains the perfect matching wounds, the identical missing skulls, the overpowering warm rot smell, the giggle following me across the dunes, or the sense, the absolute certainty that something was moving with me in the dark. I still hike sometimes, only in daytime, and nowhere near Dunbrannock. In the vast, unforgiving reaches of Idaho's sawtooth wilderness, where jagged peaks tear into the sky and pine forests stretch for miles unbroken, there lingers the story of a woman whose name still echoes among the trees. Ida Murray, forest ranger, naturalist, trailblazer. In 1967, at the age of 71, she disappeared during what should have been a routine patrol, but nothing about what followed could be called routine. To those who knew her, Ida was a fixture of the wilderness. She had dedicated her life to these mountains, this land, long before conversation was fashionable or women wore the ranger's badge. Her small frame belied the strength within, and her quiet demeanor masked a fierce determination that had carried her through decades of service. She was not simply respected, she was revered. The wilderness wasn't a job for Ida. It was a home, and she knew it better than most know their own neighborhoods. She was last seen in late August 1967. That morning had dawned warm, with the haze of wildfire smoke drifting lazily between the peaks, common enough in those summers. Ida packed lightly, as she always did, just her rucksack, journal, water flask, and a few provisions. She was heading into a familiar zone west of Redfish Lake, tasked with checking trail conditions, marking erosion patterns, and observing wildlife behavior. She left a note at the ranger station. She expected to return by sundown. But Ida never came back. When she missed her evening radio check-in, her fellow rangers were concerned, but not alarmed. Ida had spent unplanned nights in the backcountry before. Still, by the next morning, unease had turned to dread. A search team mobilized. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters made low passes over the canyons. Rangers hiked every known trail, calling her name into the pines, listening for any reply. Days passed, then weeks. No sign. Not a torn scrap of clothing, not even a boot print. Not a single page from her journal. The ground, it seemed, had swallowed her whole. The terrain didn't help. The sawtooths are beautiful, yes, but beautiful in a way. A thunderstorm is beautiful. It hides danger. Sheer rock faces, hidden ravines, fast-moving creeks, snowfields that persist into summer. In some places, the undergrowth is so dense that you could walk within 10 feet of someone and never know it. Still, to vanish without a trace, for someone as experienced and skilled as Ida, that was harder to understand. Rumors began to stir, not among the rangers, who clung to practical explanations, but in nearby towns like Stanley and Ketchum. Some whispered about accidents, others about foul play, a few more quietly, mentioned something stranger. There had been sightings, they said. Strange shapes moving upright in the forest. Reports of strange howls echoing through the valleys in the weeks before her disappearance. The term Bigfoot was whispered, not spoken out loud, of course. Most dismissed it, but even skeptics admitted that the wilderness could be odd. Unexplained things had happened here. 7 years passed. In 1974, a trio of backpackers, college students from Boise, were making their way along the Salmon River Trail. The summer was dry. The rivers were low. One of them wandered a short distance off trail in search of firewood and stumbled upon something pale, caught between two boulders. At first, they thought it was driftwood. It wasn't. Authorities arrived the following morning. The remains were skeletal, scattered, but unmistakably human. A ranger badge lay amongst the bones, and remnants of Ida's journal, worn and faded, confirmed what no one wanted to believe, but everyone had long suspected. Ida Murray had finally been found. But the relief was short-lived. During the forensic examination, experts noted something unusual: deep scoring on the bones of her legs, specifically her femur and tibia. They weren't the bite marks of a mountain lion or wolf. The spacing was wrong, the depth inconsistent. Some teeth impressions were too narrow, others too wide. No predator native to the region could be matched to the wounds. A state anthropologist publicly stated that the damage, quote, could not be positively attributed to any known animal, end quote. Quietly, more unsettling theories emerged, suggesting the marks were made post-mortem, possibly even by something with opposable digits. The phrase was odd and unsettling. Something with hands? Ida's cause of death was ruled inconclusive. Hypothermia, perhaps, a fall, dehydration. But that didn't account for how her body ended up miles from her intended patrol route, over ridges she likely wouldn't have crossed, and without leaving any sign of a struggle. Over the years, her story twisted into local lore. Hikers told tales around the campfire. Some said Ida had been lured off trail by something calling her name. Others claimed she was chased. A few believed she'd discovered something in the wilderness, something she wasn't meant to see. The United States Forest Service quietly closed off the region near her final resting place for, quote, trail repair, though no repair was ever completed. Forest rangers rarely speak of her now, and older ones still pause near the northern ridgelines. Some leave a hand against the trees, as if remembering her presence. Every August, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a small ceremony is held at the Redfish Lake Visitor Center. A bench sits there now, inscribed with Ida's name. New rangers are told her story, not as a warning, but as a reminder that the forest is not ours, that even those who live closest to nature are not exempt from its power. Today, Ida Murray remains a part of the land she loved, as much a mystery as the mountains themselves. Her bones were found, her legacy preserved, but the truth, what really happened in those final moments, lies hidden in the wind through the pines, in the shadows between the trees, in the cold clarity of an alpine morning. Maybe it always will. I grew up in the kind of place most people picture when they think of rural British Columbia. Not the postcard lakes and ski chalets, but the stretches of forest that feel like they go on forever. My name is Christina, Chris for short. My family's house sat at the end of a long gravel road outside a small town in the interior. No neighbors within easy walking distance, just thick tree lines and the sound of the wind moving through them. When I say we lived in the forest, I mean it literally. The tree line started a few feet beyond our property and swallowed everything else in every direction. As a kid, that felt normal. The forest was just there, like an extra room that belonged to everyone and no one. I played in it, explored it, learned its trails and smells and moods. By the summer of 2019, when this happened, I was 12, old enough to roam around with a friend without adults hovering, but still young enough to think almost nothing truly bad could happen in the places I knew so well. That day had been one of those slow summer days that seemed to stretch on forever. The heat hung between the trees, and insects droned in the background like white noise. I remember feeling restless in that way only kids do, where the entire world is somehow too big and too small at the same time. I called my friend Mira and asked if she wanted to come over. She lived a bit closer to town, but she knew our place well and liked the forest as much as I did. Her parents dropped her off in the afternoon, and we did what we always did. Wandered around the property, messed with my dog, talked about nothing, invented games to chew time. By early evening, we started to feel that familiar boredom creep back in. We had already exhausted the usual spots around the yard, and the sky had begun to turn that pale late summer color where the heat is still there, but the light is softening. One of us suggested a walk down the forest road. The gravel road that led to our house continued past it as a narrow track threading deeper between the trees. It wasn't paved, barely maintained, but we'd walked it many times. It curved gently, rose and fell a little, and eventually split in two directions. We both loved scary stories and weird internet lore. The forest at dusk, for us, felt more like an opportunity than a threat. It was the kind of place where your imagination could dress shadows up as monsters for fun. So we set off down the road. As we walked, we talked about the usual things. Half-remembered creepy stories, kids from school, what we were going to do when we got older. The forest on either side of us felt familiar. Tall conifers, reaching up into the fading light, underbrush thick, but not impenetrable. The occasional opening where the ground sloped away into shallow dips. For the first 20 or 30 minutes, everything felt completely normal. Birds called from the branches overhead. An occasional car sound drifted faintly from the main road far off, then disappeared again into the hum of insects. Eventually, we reached the place where the road split. There was no sign, no indication of where either fork led. Just one track, leading a bit uphill to the left, disappearing behind a stand of trees, and another continuing straight, slightly downhill, and into thicker shade. We stopped where the gravel divided. There was no real plan. We just wanted to pick whichever direction felt more interesting. I felt drawn toward the left, uphill path. Mira said she wanted to keep going straight, toward the denser trees. We stood there, arguing in that light, when we noticed it. The forest had gone quiet. One moment there was the sound of birds, the soft buzz of insects, the whisper of leaves. The next moment, there was nothing. The silence felt physical, like someone had placed a glass dome over the world and shut everything else out. The only sound left was our own breathing and the faint crunch of gravel as we shifted our weight. And something else. Footsteps. They came from somewhere beyond the tree line, off to the side, in the spaces between the trunks. At first they were slow and deliberate, spaced out like someone walking cautiously through the brush. We both went still. Our earlier conversation dropped away, like it had never existed. The two of us stood there at the fork in the road, listening. The footsteps continued, crunching on twigs, brushing leaves aside, getting closer. Every so often there was a faint scrape, as if something bony or hard was dragging along the ground. Because we were who we were, two kids obsessed with the strange and inexplicable, we didn't run. We told ourselves it was probably a deer, or someone out walking, or an animal we could later brag about seeing. The footsteps picked up speed. They shifted from a careful walking pace to something like a fast walk, then a jog. They came from our right, somewhere in the trees along the side of the road, where the undergrowth was thinner and shafts of late light still made it through. Then they stopped, like whatever was moving had suddenly frozen in place. Mira and I locked eyes. I remember how wide her eyes were in that dimming light, how all our past jokes about ghosts and monsters suddenly felt like they had been rehearsals for this moment, without us knowing it. Before either of us could say anything, it came out. From between two thick tree trunks, about 20 feet ahead of us, and slightly off to the right, a shape lunged into view. At first, my brain refused to make sense of it. It looked like a person who had been stretched taller than they were meant to be, maybe 7 feet tall, with limbs a little too long and too thin. Its body had the rough outline of a human, but everything else was wrong. One side of its body, the entire right half from head to foot, looked black. Not like clothing or fur, but like the skin itself was an absence of light. The left half was a sickly gray, the color of old paper or something that had not seen the sun in years. That half looked dry and tight, wrapped over bones with almost nothing between them. It had no face, or if it did, I couldn't find anything to hold on to. No eyes I could clearly see, no mouth that registered, no features to anchor as human. Just smoothness where a face should have been, like something unfinished. It looked like a skeleton held together by too thin skin. The ribs were visible, each one standing out like fingers, gripping its own chest from the inside. The legs were long, jointed in the normal places, but almost stick-like. Its arms hung too low, hands nearly reaching past its knees. I realized in that moment that I couldn't hear it breathing. The stillness around us made that detail stand out more. There was no panting, no gasp from whatever this was, despite the fact that it had clearly just sprinted from somewhere. I stood frozen, staring at this impossibility standing on the edge of the road. At some point in those first seconds, Mira ran. I didn't see her go. One moment she was beside me, the next I was alone at the fork, with my gaze locked onto this thing in front of me. My body stayed rooted where it was, as if my mind had decided that if I just didn't move, the world would give me a different shape to put in front of my eyes. Then it moved again. It dropped. The tall, thin figure collapsed forward in a way no normal person could. Its arms hit the ground first, then its legs followed, and suddenly it was on all fours. Not hands and knees in a clumsy crawl, but a fast, fluid stance like a predator about to sprint. Seeing that broke whatever spell had me frozen in place. Every hair on my body rose. A loud, primal alarm rang in my head, a sensation that screamed wrong in a way I can't fully describe. This was not a person. This wasn't any animal I recognized. It was something my brain had no file for. Then it began to run. The movement was horrific. Its limbs worked in a smooth, unnatural coordination, the long arms and legs propelling it forward with a speed that looked impossible for something so thin. The spine flexed in a strange way, like it was built more like an insect's than a mammal's. It ran in my direction. That was enough. My body finally obeyed the terror that had been building in my chest. I turned and ran back down the road the way we had come, gravel sliding under my shoes as I tried to get traction. I didn't look back. Every sound felt amplified. The rush of my own breath, the pounding of my heart, the thud of my footsteps. The forest around me remained silent, as if the whole world had stepped aside to let this one thing happen. I ran like I had never run in my life. The road blurred. My legs burned. At some point, the fear of falling, of twisting an ankle, of anything else, vanished. The first place on the road that felt like safety was my neighbor's property, a small clearing and house that sat a good distance before ours. By the time I saw the familiar outline of their yard, my legs were shaking and my lungs felt like they were on fire. I sprinted toward their driveway and almost collided with Mira, who had made it there ahead of me and was half hidden behind some bushes near their fence. She looked terrified in a way I had never seen before. Face pale, eyes rimmed with red, breathing erratic. She asked what the thing had been, her voice sharp and panicked, as if saying it out loud might help keep it real. I told her I had no idea. The two of us stood there trying to catch our breath, glancing back down the road, expecting at any second to see that tall shape appear at the curve. It didn't. Eventually, we forced ourselves to walk the rest of the way back to my house together. Neither of us wanted to be alone on that road again. Every sound in the trees felt threatening. The forest we had known all our lives suddenly felt occupied. At first, I tried to tell myself it had been a trick of the light, or a person, or some deformed animal, or a combination of fear and imagination. But the image of that thing wouldn't let me push it into any normal category. Years later, I finally started talking about it online. I described the forest, the silence, the footsteps, the height, the way it moved. I tried to be as honest as possible, admitting where my memory might be fuzzy and where it wasn't. People responded with a lot of different ideas. Everything from a very sick moose to a man in some kind of costume. But one suggestion came up over and over, especially from people familiar with certain corners of internet horror. They told me it sounded like something called the rake. I had never heard of it before. So, curious and a little afraid of what I might find, I looked it up. Most descriptions I found agreed on a few things. The rake is usually described as a pale, hairless creature, emaciated and human-shaped. It is said to be unnaturally tall when standing, but often moves on all fours. People talk about it having long limbs, sunken or hollow eyes, and a body that looks like a starved person, stretched too far. It shows up in forests, near rural homes, in bedrooms at night. I still don't know what I saw. Maybe it was a real person with a severe condition, though that doesn't explain the way it moved. Maybe it was an animal my brain interpreted as humanoid under stress, though I grew up around wildlife, and nothing matches. Maybe my 12-year-old mind fused fear with something ordinary and built a monster out of it. Or maybe there are more things in the forests than we like to admit. A lot of what I read and researched was clearly fiction. Creepypasta, drawings, embellished stories. I know that. But reading through page after page of people describing something thin, pale or gray, long-limbed, faceless, running on all fours through wooded areas, it did something to me. Because even if the rake is just a story someone invented years ago, it lined up uncomfortably well with what I remember seeing that evening in 2019 on that forest road in British Columbia. Day 1. They drove through the snow in near silence, the hum of the engine barely masking the tension between them. The trip had been Luca's idea. One last try, he said. A few days in the mountains to remember what it used to feel like. Before the distance. Before the silence. No phones, no fights. Just time. Amber had agreed, not because she believed it would fix anything, but because part of her wanted to believe he still meant it. They weren't angry with each other, not anymore, just careful, like strangers in a house that used to be theirs. The road narrowed as they climbed. No cell signal, no GPS, just a handwritten set of directions and the occasional green marker pole jutting up from the banks of snow. Black trees pressed on both sides, their branches drooping under the weight of the winter. A sign for Hollow Lake appeared and vanished just as quickly, half buried in ice and rust. Lucas kept his eyes on the road. Amber kept hers on the forest. The cabin appeared around the final bend. A boxy A-frame nestled at the edge of the frozen lake, its porch half covered by a drift of untouched snow. There were no other cabins in sight, just pine, ice, and that creeping hush that settles in places too far removed from people. Lucas got out first, and then wrestled with the front door key. Amber stood still for a long time beside the car, watching the wind scrape tiny waves across the surface of the lake. Inside, the cabin was simple. Hand-carved dining chairs, a stone fireplace, a few framed photos of long-dead fishermen with frozen smiles and heavy coats. The hearth was cold. The pipes groaned when Lucas tested the sink. Amber didn't unpack. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, coat still on, scanning the corners of the room without really seeing them. Lucas brought in wood and started a fire. Then they ate dinner in silence. By nightfall, the sky outside was a smear of dark blue behind the tall windows. No curtains, just glass, and the reflection of the fire flickering behind them. Lucas suggested playing cards. Amber nodded but didn't move. Eventually, she said she was going to bed. Lucas stayed in the living room staring at the fire like it held answers. The silence deepened as the night stretched on. No cars, no owls, not even the sound of branches shifting in the wind. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just a sense that the quiet here had depth to it, like it could listen. Day 2. They spent most of the day outside, circling the edge of the lake in wide, quiet loops. The ice stretched out in every direction, dull under the cloud cover, layered in fresh powder. No tracks but theirs. No birds overhead, just the sound of snow crunching beneath their boots and the occasional creak of settling ice in the distance. Lucas carried a small hatchet, pausing now and then to collect branches near the tree line. He mentioned the firewood pile was running low, but Amber wasn't really listening. She wandered the shoreline with her hands in her coat pockets, pausing to stare into the trees like she was expecting them to shift. She had brought her camera, but never raised it once. At one point, Lucas turned to say something, maybe to point out an animal track, maybe just to fill the silence, but she was already walking away, her figure small against the expanse of snow. They returned to the cabin in late afternoon, each carrying armfuls of wood, breathing heavy from the cold. Lucas built a new stack by the fireplace. Amber shook the snow from her coat and started boiling water on the stove. For a moment, they sat on the floor in front of the hearth with bowls of instant soup between them. The fire cracked softly behind the quiet. Lucas made a small comment, something about the silence being good for them. A clean slate, like starting over. Amber smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Later, while washing the dishes, she asked how long the trip was supposed to be. 4 nights, Lucas said, drying a mug with the corner of his flannel sleeve. She nodded. Nothing else. Outside, the sky had turned a dim metallic gray. The trees across the lake looked further away now, blurred at the edges, almost smudged. The cabin felt smaller with the windows darkening. The fire didn't seem to warm quite as much. They sat on opposite sides of the room without meaning to. By dusk, the cold had thickened into the glass again. The lake was vanishing into fog, and the trees beyond it looked like figures pressed into the frosted glass. Then came the knock. 3 slow raps against the front door. Not loud, just deliberate, measured, like someone who knew there was no need to rush. Lucas was alone in the living room, half dozing near the fireplace, the light from the flames casting long shadows across the cabin walls. He opened his eyes slowly, unsure if the sound had been part of a dream. The knock came again. He sat up, the blanket sliding from his shoulders. The fire had burned low, just a glow now. The rest of the room was dark, save for the dim blue light bleeding in through the front windows. He moved quietly toward the door, pausing with his hand just above the knob. The air on the other side felt colder, like the draft was pressing inward. He waited. No third knock. no voice, just silence. Lucas turned on the porch light. The bulb flickered once, then held. He hesitated, then opened the door. The snow outside glowed faintly under its glare, untouched, smooth as plaster. No footprints, no shifting branches. Nothing but the night and the soft whisper of the wind across the lake. A rush of cold swept in, biting against his bare skin. The porch creaked beneath his feet. He stepped out far enough to lean and peer into the trees, but saw nothing. No movement. He listened for a long moment, then stepped back inside and closed the door. Day 3. He didn't mention it to Amber when she stirred the next morning. Not right away. Only over coffee, when the silence between them grew too noticeable, did he say something about hearing a noise the night before. She glanced at him over the rim of her mug and asked, like what? Lucas shrugged and said it could have been the wind, just 3 knocks on the door. Amber didn't answer, just set her cup down and opened the fridge. She didn't laugh, didn't call it ridiculous, but she didn't ask any more questions either. Lucas didn't press. He stood up from the table and went outside to chop more wood. When he returned, they made the decision to drive into town. The woodpile was stocked now, and neither of them had the energy for another full day in the cold. Besides, Amber said they needed more coffee. That was the excuse. The nearest town was 20 minutes downhill, one road, winding and sharp at the edges, bordered by snowbanks that had hardened into ice. The place was barely more than a few buildings, a gas station, a post office that looked long abandoned, and a diner with 2 pickup trucks parked out front. They chose the diner. Inside, the heat was dry and artificial. Old plastic booths, a soda machine humming near the back, and a radio playing low behind the counter. The waitress greeted them like she hadn't seen new faces in weeks. She poured their coffee before they ordered anything. Amber asked if a lot of people stayed near Hollow Lake this time of year. The waitress took a beat, then said no, not since the lodge burned down. She didn't explain further. Lucas asked if she ever heard stories of knocking out there. He said it casually with a shrug, like he already knew the answer would be no. The waitress didn't answer right away. She looked between them. Her expression changed, just slightly. Then she responded by saying, "Don't open the door if it knocks." Nothing more. No smile. No curiosity. Just the sentence, "Don't open the door if it knocks." Then she turned away and went back to the coffee machine. Amber stared at her reflection in the window for the rest of the meal. Lucas didn't finish his eggs. They bought batteries and a spare lighter at the gas station on the way out. The man behind the counter didn't ask what they were for. He just bagged the items, handed them over, and said, "Storm's picking up again. Won't be many roads open tomorrow." Lucas thanked him. By the time they returned back to the cabin, the sky had started to darken again. The lake was dull and flat, the trees unmoving. But the feeling, the weight, was back. The firewood they'd stacked earlier that morning looked smaller now, like it had been disturbed. Amber paused at the front door before going inside. She didn't know why, just that something felt off. By dusk, the lake was vanishing into fog, and the trees beyond it looked like figures pressed against frosted glass. The fire sputtered more than it crackled, and the wood Lucas had chopped burned faster than it should have. Every few minutes, one of them would get up to add more. Neither said anything about it, but the silence between them had changed. Not quieter, heavier. The windows rattled occasionally, but not with the wind. It was more like a deep vibration, as though something beyond the walls had weight and was moving. They turned in early, but neither could sleep. The firelight pulsed faintly down the hallway, and from the bed, Amber watched shadows crawl across the ceiling, reshaped by the light of shifting flames. Sometime after midnight, it knocked again. This time, Amber heard it too. 3 slow knocks. Not frantic, not loud, just steady, like a metronome that had been counting down from the start. She sat up, pulse already racing. She didn't call out, just listened. In the living room, Lucas was already awake. He'd heard it too. The front porch light flickered on, automatically this time, as if triggered. Snow lit up under the bulb, just like before. Lucas stood near the door, staring through the peephole. Then he stepped back, turned, then 3 more knocks from the back of the cabin. Amber was standing now in the hallway. There were no back steps, no porch, just snow against a bare rear wall, and pine trees beyond that. The knock came again. Slower now. From the far wall. 3 dull thuds. Then again. This time on the side window, the one overlooking the tree line, as if whatever it was had circled the entire house without making a sound in the snow. Amber stepped into the living room, her voice barely above a whisper. She asked Lucas not to open it. Lucas was already at the door, hand on the knob. Then the knock came again, closer. Amber touched his arm, stopping him. They stood there for a long time. The silence outside grew absolute. Lucas stepped away. Neither of them slept. By morning, the fire had gone out. The cabin felt colder than it had since they arrived. Day 4. The next day was pretty uneventful. They still had enough firewood stacked from the day before. The day felt long. Lucas and Amber's conversation always felt like a transaction. Lucas pretended to be interested in the small collection of books on the shelves. That night, they tried to go to bed early, but the air in the bedroom felt wrong, like someone else had been in there first. Amber lay awake with her eyes open, watching the ceiling. Lucas sat in the living room sharpening the hatchet with slow, deliberate strokes. He wasn't sure why, just that it felt necessary. Then, at 2:17 a.m., the knock came again. 3 slow raps. Front door. They waited. 3 more. This time at the back. Then the side wall. Then the bedroom door. Lucas stood. Amber was already in the hallway. They didn't speak. The knocking resumed. Now it came from all sides at once. Slow, measured, rhythmic, as if surrounding them, as if waiting. And then a voice. Quiet, right at the door. It called Amber's name. Not whispered, not shouted, just spoken, like it knew her, like it had always known her. She backed away. Lucas stepped forward. She told him not to open it. Lucas stared at her, then at the door. The voice called again. Her name, then his. Lucas reached for the handle. Amber stepped between him and the door, eyes wide, her voice shaking now. She told him if he opened it, it wouldn't be him anymore. It wouldn't stop at him. The voice called out one more time, then fell silent. They stood like that for a long time, frozen, between whatever was outside and whatever was breaking them apart inside. Eventually, Lucas stepped away. Amber made sure the door was locked. The knocks didn't come again. Day 5. By morning, the snow outside was deeper than ever. It had stormed all night. The trail they'd carved days earlier was gone. Even the porch looked unfamiliar, like it belonged to a different cabin entirely. A snowdrift was pressed against their car, tires sunken deep in the snow. They both knew their vehicle wouldn't be able to be moved anytime soon. Lucas said they should try to hike out. Amber agreed, though her voice sounded distant to her own ears, like it was echoing from somewhere behind her. The sky was pale, drained of color. The trees bent slightly under the weight of the snow, forming a tunnel as they moved down the narrow path. A mile in, they heard it again. 3 soft knocks, off to the side, just beyond the tree line. Lucas stopped, turned toward it. Amber said his name. He looked back at her and smiled. That was when she knew. It wasn't the wrong shape or some grotesque imitation. It was perfect. Too perfect, like a painting of someone she used to love. His eyes were still, empty, his movements just a fraction too smooth. He reached out, not fast, just gently, as if inviting her to follow. Amber ran. She didn't know how far, just enough to lose sight of him, enough to feel the world bend around her again. And when she reached the cabin, the same one, though she could have sworn she'd run the other direction, the door was already open. The fire inside was burning. Her mug was still on the table. Footsteps crunched behind her. She didn't turn around. She stepped inside, sat down at the table. The fire popped. Warmth crept up her arms. Something inside her relaxed. And when the footsteps reached the doorway and she heard her name spoken again, she smiled, not because she wanted to, but because something else already had. Epilogue. Two figures walked down the slush-lined road into town, a man and a woman, bundled in winter coats, their boots caked in snow. They moved in sync, turned their heads the same way when cars passed, smiled the same smile when strangers nodded hello. They gave names, said they'd stayed at a cabin by the lake, just needed a jump, maybe a ride to the next station. Nice people, grateful. No one questioned them. They looked normal enough, but if you watched them closely, really watched, you'd notice something strange. The way their smiles lingered too long, the way they spoke, like they'd practiced it, and the way they always paused, just briefly, when someone knocked. If you enjoyed these stories, please consider subscribing to the channel. Give it a like, a comment, and maybe a share. But if you didn't like the stories, maybe share it with someone you don't like. In any case, I'm glad you stuck around to the end.